During this global pandemic and era of social distancing, I spoke with Anita remotely from our offices in Washington, D.C.
When the pandemic first hit, it was pretty obvious what the impacts were going to be on women, and they were principally the triple whammy of impacts on income, on health, and security. On income, because a lot of women lost jobs, because many of the sectors that were hit hard by the pandemic were heavily feminized: retail, tourism, domestic work. Health, because we saw not only that most frontline workers were women, but also because access to reproductive health services, I wouldn't say disappeared, but definitely was reduced during the pandemic because governments appropriately had to pivot to solving the public health crisis that COVID-19 presented. And security, because we saw this huge spike, huge escalation in violence against women. But what we didn't quite foresee was the impact that the pandemic was going to have on women's care burden. We knew that even before the pandemic, women were doing 3 times as much unpaid care as men. But what we've seen in the last year is that that care burden has just shot up exponentially. And it is now revealing its real ugly face in terms of reduced female labor force participation, because we are hearing stories from all over the world of women who simply cannot go back to work because of this care burden.
Let's unpack some of this a little bit. On the health aspect, I think about health in respect to anxiety, because women tend to internalize a lot of this stuff too. I mean, if you're worried about your parents perhaps getting COVID, you're worried about your kids getting the right kind of education, you're worried about your job, you're worried about your husband. Talk to me about that mental health piece of this too, because I think that's something that's been largely overlooked as well.
It has been. And, when Michelle Obama came out and said she'd been suffering from a little bit of depression, it was really a signal to, I think, a lot of women to say, I can acknowledge this. I can say that I'm really having a difficult time. And mental health at the best of times is something that's difficult to talk about. And mental health issues are never treated the same way as physical health issues to start with. So when we saw this escalation, which we continue to see in mental health issues, I think both governments and the private sector found themselves at a bit of a loss, because there is no infrastructure in place to really deal with the kinds of mental health issues that we had seen. And the impacts of this, I think, are going to be felt for years. It's because we have had to turn as women to informal networks of support. And those who are privileged enough to turn to actual help, that's great. But for the majority of women, they don't have the luxury of time to do this, to seek the counseling and the psychosocial support they may need. But also for a lot of women, particularly those who've been hit with economic fallout from the crisis, they don't have the resources to get the help they need.
Anita was born and raised in India. In 2019, she was appointed as UN Women's Deputy Executive Director. Previously, she worked for the World Bank Group on gender equality, financial inclusion, and support to women-owned businesses. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in History from Calcutta University, a Master of Arts in Political Science from Yale University, and a Juris Doctor in Law from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Let me ask you about the income piece, because when you look at the frontline workers, scientists, doctors, caregivers, women are there, but they're paid 11% less than their male counterparts. Are we making any progress whatsoever at achieving parity?
Not enough, and not quickly enough. There is one country in the world, Iceland, which has just passed legislation making it mandatory to have equal pay. And we have 193 member states in the UN. So I think we can do a lot better. And here is there's a role for public policy, but there's also a role for the private sector and for business to step up. And as the largest creator of jobs in most parts of the world, it is really important that business lead on this and that business be transparent about what it's paying men and women for similar kinds of work, and that they have recognized that they have an affirmative responsibility to make sure that they are actually role modeling equal pay. That doesn't happen today. Companies are trying, but not hard enough and not fast enough.
But women are there. They're the face of so many of these movements and in leadership positions. And yet when we look at the landscape, political leadership, the women are not there to a large degree. What needs to be done there?
A lot. I do think that the state of women's representation and women's roles in decision making is such that we're going to have to take some extraordinary measures to get even some semblance of parity. So first, I think we just need to look at the data. So you're going to be shocked by this, but there are only 13 countries in the world that have gender equal cabinets. 13. That's pretty remarkable in this day and age. Then when you look at parliaments, 75% of parliamentarians or legislators worldwide are men. So that's in 2021. Then when you look at how many heads of state or heads of government are women, it's less than 10%. And then the latest statistic that I saw, which was about decision making and gender parity in task forces on COVID, less than 5%, 3.5% to be precise, of the task forces that have been set up around the world to tackle COVID have gender parity. So we are a long, long, long way from seeing anything like equal representation. So what we need to do about that is to actually enact temporary special measures. There should be quotas, there should be targets, there should be transparency, and this is something that we need political will to implement at the highest level. This has got to be something where, when somebody gets elected, a new president, a new prime minister, they have to say, we care about this and we're going to walk the talk, and we're going to have gender equal cabinets, and we're going to ask everybody in our administration to role model this. And businesses and CEOs can do this too. Why is it that we have the first CEO of a major Wall Street firm be a woman for the first time in 2021? I mean, for heaven's sakes, we're not in 1721.
As cities around the world went into lockdown, victims of domestic violence were desperately searching for a way out. Anita says around the globe, abusers were provided an opportunity to unleash more violence. Let's talk about the security piece, because I know of cases where women are in relationships, they seem fine, but all of a sudden you're cooped up with your husband, there's a lot of stress there, and things can become abusive. I know of a case where a woman, a professional, who actually had to leave the house during the pandemic and go stay with somebody else because it had gotten kind of dicey. That's not uncommon, is it?
Sadly, no. And those of us who work on gender equality and women's empowerment have known for years, for decades, that violence against women is a shadow pandemic. And that's what the Secretary General called it. He said it's a shadow pandemic. And he asked for a ceasefire at home, because home, which is the place where you expect to be safe, turned out to be one of the places that was least safe for women during the pandemic. And, there is this stereotype that violence against women affects women perhaps from lower economic strata in society, and that's absolutely not the case. Violence knows no barriers, whether it's class or income, race, or religion. It is unfortunately all pervasive and omnipresent in pretty much every country in the world. And one of the things that we saw during the last year is that because it became visible, something that we knew existed became visible in a way that it hadn't been. We actually had governments talking about this in a way that we hadn't quite seen before. And so, to the extent that there's some sort of a silver lining, I would say the fact that this moved out of the realm of being thought of as an individual or a family issue and became a public policy issue, that was encouraging. We had governments actually coming out and saying, gosh, the levels of violence are so high that we have to do something about it. And so you saw, for instance, the government of France having to rent 20,000 hotel rooms for women who had no other place to go to. You saw some governments coming up with codes that women could use in pharmacies to get help by saying, mask 19, which was code word for saying help. You saw, Australia come out and say there had been more searches on Google for help for violence against women than almost anything else. So, there was an acknowledgement of the size of the problem, but sadly, there still aren't enough public policy measures to deal with this. We need many more resources and much more attention to be paid to this issue, which in the end is a public health crisis.
Speaking of bringing attention to the security of women, in London, as you know, there were the protests the other day, clashes with women with the police. But it seems to me, if you spend any time on social media, these heartfelt exchanges that women sharing with one another, their own experiences, are women finding their voice during this crisis, in a sense, and are men listening more?
Women have and are finding their voices. These voices have always been around. They've gotten louder because of the levels of escalation. And I think, we are just fed up as women of having to constantly have to be worried about our safety and our security. The recent poll that came out in the UK was very revealing, where pretty much every woman who was interviewed said, I have been subject to harassment of some sort or the other, right? I've been assaulted, I have been followed, I have been catcalled or something at some point in my life, and seriously harassed, not just, seriously harassed. So I think the time has come to change the discourse. Enough talk about what women need to do. Let's turn the dialogue around. Let's talk about what men need to do and what we need to do to keep men away from women. If men cannot control themselves, then let's consider some really radical measures like the ones that are now being proposed in England. Perhaps there should be a curfew for men after a certain hour. Why is the burden of care and self-care and security falling on women?
When it comes to the social and economic consequences of the pandemic, it is women who are more likely to bear the brunt, as noted by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres shortly after the coronavirus emerged in 2020.
COVID-19 could reverse the limited progress that has been made on gender equality and women's rights, and recommends ways to put women's leadership and contributions at the heart of resilience and recovery.
Now, with the pandemic set to stretch well into 2021, his words are looking less like a warning than a prediction. There's all of these dynamics at play that we haven't even had a chance to talk about because there are, the income inequality as well as the gender issue. Combine that together with the pandemic, it's just a cauldron, isn't it?
It is, and when you get all these issues put together, obviously it compounds the problem. And as you have rightly, alluded to this issue of this cauldron, as you call it. It's a nice way to describe it because, look, things, I've always said the pandemic has deepened inequality. I mean, inequality was pretty bad to start with before the pandemic. The pandemic has just made it a lot worse. And what it's done is it has divided the world into women who have care burdens and women who don't. And by the way, the number of people in that category of women who don't have care burdens is pretty small. And then it's divided the world into those who have digital access and those who don't. Inequalities have been sharpened by the pandemic. And I think if we have to build back better, we have to actually start thinking about how you build back equal. It's not enough just to say better. It is important to say it's about building back equal. And that means we have to worry about those who are doubly affected, not just by income inequality, but by racial injustice and by other kinds of discrimination that have multiplier discriminatory effects on them. And that's not a simple issue of public policy, but it does require thoughtfulness. And and there are options, there are policy options for governments and business to undertake, to solve for this. But again, it is not going to happen unless you sit down and say, I am purposefully going to apply a gender lens to this policy. And I'm going to ask myself, as we enact this law or this measure, how is it going to impact women? How is it going to impact Black women? How is it going to impact disabled people? How is it going to impact people of color? How is it going to impact people who don't have access to transport, to infrastructure, to the internet? So nothing is going to happen just because you have crafted, what on paper may be an extremely good public policy if you haven't been intentional about a gender lens and an intersectional lens.
Is this also an opportunity, though? Do you see it as a chance for everyone to really kind of look at it through the lens you just described, hit the reset button, and perhaps we emerge from this going in another direction?
We could if we do a couple of things right. I think all budgets henceforth need to be gender responsive. We have a lot of experience in doing gender responsive budgeting. It's a lot harder than it sounds, but it's something we need to actually start to do. So certainly as far as gender equality is concerned, it's a great opportunity to build back better, greener, to think about a smaller carbon footprint, and to think about those new jobs, the green jobs that can also be jobs for women. But that's not going to happen without policymakers, governments, presidents actually sitting down to say, I care about this issue and I'm going to apply that lens in all of my decision making.
Well, let's hope they do it. Anita, a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much.